Chapter 22. Monday, the 10th of October 2016, 12:55 a.m. Monarch Tower, time lab. 1 minute local after Jack's departure. Jack and Will clasped each other's hands as they walked the promenade side by side, in lockstep, staying within sync as they walked 2 nights forward. What you'll see is going to be shocking, Will. Fair warning.
I've been prepared for this since we were 10. I'm confident I can handle it.
Arriving at the airlock, they opened the seal and stepped to the first hour of Monday morning. Jack checked through the viewplate. The airlock hissed, the seals depressurizing, and the two brothers stepped out onto the ramp.
Oh,
Will said.
I expected something more dramatic.
Then,
is that music?
what they heard was a lilting series of high notes, as though someone in a distant room were plinking on a xylophone, building from slow rhythm to something faster. Coming under this simple score, abruptly, was the sound countless girders might make if they were bent and tearing beneath the weight they could no longer support. The floor shifted alarmingly, betraying them as far wall detached and slipping away without so much as a sound. Freezing air rushed in, and far below came the sound of hundreds and tons of concrete, glass, and iron waterfalling clumsily and catastrophically into the street. Riverport, bucking, flaming, dying, laid itself bare to them. Will walked across the buckled floor, toward the torn open wall, perhaps drawn by something only he could understand. Something written in the pulsing, wailing, pointillist nightmare landscape spread before him. Or perhaps he was simply a man who was just looking upon what he had done, and found himself overcome by the horror of it. Jack reached for him, pulled him back from the ragged edge, and saw for himself what was becoming of the town that had raised him.
Will!
Jack shouted above the high-altitude wind.
Can you stop this?
He unslung his pack, opened it, showed Will the countermeasure.
Can you?
The sight of the device drew Will out of his shock. He nodded.
I could try. It's what I built it for, yes. Yes, I believe so. I need to get it into the machine.
Taking the device from the bag, turning it over in his hands, Will said,
The charge is unusually low.
Monarch was shielding the top floors from the stutter with it, running some kind of dampener network. Probably running a bunch of other crap as well, I have no idea. Will looked out across that terribly wounded city.
He
struggled to find the words.
Causality relies upon an agreed-upon sequence of events. This creates what we understand as the flow of time. The fracture is inviting other potential realities to the mix. What was once a song is now a violent confusion. This building is falling apart beneath us.
Well, actually, Jack said, it's a little of that and a little of me throwing a train through the reception area, he shrugged.
It was locked.
Will took the countermeasure and headed for the time machine when a voice said,
Jack!
Jack scanned around, the corners, the control room above. No one was here. Will didn't seem to have heard it. Examining the countermeasure, he walked to the machine.
Jack!
Paul? Jack stopped cold. Paul was in the airlock, standing on the ramp, looking into the room with terror on his face. This wasn't the Paul whom Jack had seen drop a building on his brother. This is Paul as he had been the night he had first traveled through the machine. Will carefully put the countermeasure down near the story-high platform case Chronon Reserve Monarch used to power the machine and began an examination of the power routing it to the promenade. As Jack moved toward his friend who had been, a second figure materialized, standing at the bottom of the ramp. Martin Hatch. This wasn't real, Jack realized. It was a vision, like the ones he experienced back at the house.
You and I are destined to be great friends, Paul,
Hatch was saying.
It is the honor of my life to provide all that you need to play your singular role.
Hatch opened an arm toward 3 men and women, waiting to escort Paul out of the room, toward a future that turned him into the man responsible for all that was happening to the world at the moment. Jack watched young Paul Serene, baffled and lost, get shepherded away. Hatch took a cleansing breath with the air of a man who had just crossed a major milestone. Who the fuck are you, Jack thought. You monstrous son of a bitch. Hatch moved to leave, and then stopped, his back straightened curiously. Martin Hatch glanced behind himself, turned fully, then took a step toward Jack. Martin Hatch, years into the future, stood 5 feet before Jack Joyce and appeared to look him right in the eye. Jack stepped back. Slowly, carefully, Martin Hatch looked Jack up and down and smiled.
"Who the fuck are you?"
Jack said. Hatch clicked his fingers, and the vision ended. Jack was alone. The stutter hit without warning. The intercom overloaded and exploded in sparks. The glass walls the control room shattered, rewound, remained intact. For a vertiginous microsecond, the floor vanished, sharing a moment with the world where the entire building was collapsed, before native reality reasserted itself and spasmed between what is and what could be, knocking Jack and Will off their feet. Across Riverport, the skies bucked, energy flashed, shockwaves kicked down the streets and thrashed the river. Whole blocks lit up or went dark, most often vacillating between the two. The chorus of car alarms was a background song to the whole streets opening up along their length, to spot fires and infernos. Jack had no idea what was happening on the ground. If this could happen to steel and concrete, then what was happening to people?
"Jack."
"What is it, Will?" Will looked up from his examinations of a rack of connectors on the corridor ring.
"Did you say something?"
"Didn't."
"Jack."
The voice was wrong. Layered. Skitzing. Fucked up. Paul Serene stepped off the stairwell to the control room, 50 feet from Jack, broad-shouldered and almost entirely consumed by the chronon sickness that was remaking him into something monstrous. Starlight flashed beneath his clothes. The flesh of his hands and neck was a shifting play of fractal light. When he spoke, illumination poured from his throat.
"Are you ready?"
"Jesus,"
"Close enough."
Paul spasmed, a flurry of multiple Pauls all at once. He was phasing from humanity to whatever the shifters were.
"You and I die here,
He rasped.
but in doing so, save the universe."
"Will, get that thing hooked up and fast."
I have it connected to the primary chronon flow. I think we're ready."
"Then do it." Paul snorted.
"It makes no difference."
Will socketed the countermeasure to the battery's main outflow and... nothing.
"Don't fight me, Jack.
Paul was having a hard time keeping it together.
We stick together, right?"
It was then that Jack noticed the silver chain dangling from Paul's bald, luminescent fist. The chain attached to the bullet. He raised that fist.
"We've known each other all our lives. The universe, fate, arranged just so."
Paul shuddered. Multiple Pauls flashed and rioted for control of his friend's identity and were beaten back by an excruciating force of will.
"I know this because I've seen it."
"I've seen things too, Paul."
We are here now because my futures may make themselves unknown to me. And I choose the futures which are taking the world. And I know, Jack, that this is where you and I end. Because I never had a vision beyond tonight, beyond now. They all narrow to the same limit point. You fail, you die, I die, and Monarch triumphs.
Paul straightened up, then marched toward Will.
Give me the right regulator.
Jack warped to intercept. At the last second, Paul wasn't there, and Jack went careening into the diagnostic bank against the wall. Paul stopped.
This is here I am, the vision don't stop. When it's time I have the third in common. It's a tissue on arrows. The attack is wish.
Jack warped, and again, Paul wasn't there. Jack skidded, stopping short of tumbling into the maintenance recess.
But I am full of surprises.
Will ripped the countermeasure from the machine, held it before him like a weapon.
I'll breach this before I let you take it. You know it's killed you once, it can.
The countermeasure vanished from Will's grip, leaving him yelping and clutching wrenched fingers. Paul held it unconcerned.
This is meant for Martin Hatch and the future.
Jack took a gamble. In all those visions, Paul, do you ever see Hatch? Paul said nothing for a moment. Then, Paul didn't say anything. Jack smiled. Didn't enjoy it. That's what I figured. So what is it? What's off about him? Jack warped. Paul had moved, appeared farther down the lab toward the breach. You know what I'm gonna say. You know what you're gonna say. Flip ahead. Tell me how this conversation plays out.
Lives are messy,
Paul said.
Martin's is not.
Jack blinked. Meaning what? Will stepped up.
In all the futures you could see and choose from, Martin Hatch's actions never deviate. He's the most focused man I've ever met. My life, all that I am, I owe to his clarity.
Think about that, Jack said. And? Paul's outline flickered, wavered, but not in the way that Shifter spasmed out. This was more of a superimposition.
Give me.
The room tunneled and slowed as a crowd of Paul Serenes, like ghosts, like after images, stepped up, moved, gesticulated, swung, ran. Not after images, for images. Jack saw his own image dashing out, intersecting with Paul's. A million potentials exploding from all three men present to form a chaos of movement-to-movement potentiality. Too much to make sense of, so Jack narrowed focus down to what he needed. The device Paul now held. Ghosts faded. The futures in which he had made a play for the countermeasure solidified. Paul intercepted or avoided him in all of them. In some of them, Jack went flying out of that breach. He chose one where he didn't.
Countermeasure.
He shot forward. Paul wasn't there. Jack knew where he was, feigned, counted on Paul making a bad choice in the futures he was seeing. Failed. The game became one of seeing who could see deepest into the mesh of move and counter-move, and take action accordingly. Jack had far less experience, but Paul was being reassembled from the inside out. Jack zipped toward him, failed to intercept, feigned, failed, swung for him, failed, outflanked, failed. Paul flashed for the stairwell. Jack moved to intercept. Paul saw it coming and Jack had left and swung over the railing. Jack was already there, waiting. Paul swung. Jack grabbed for the countermeasure. Paul was gone. You said we'd die here, Jack gasped. Paul nodded. Got a time on that? Paul warped forward, bringing down one flash skin hand, missing, following through on the momentum, and swinging the countermeasure like a bowling ball into Jack's chest. Jack flew 6 feet and hit Jack hard. No! Will scrambled told him. You'll breach it! Paul looked at the device in his hand as though he'd never seen it before. An expression or animal confusion on his face. He glanced at Will, then as if hoping to see understanding in another's eyes.
Wars, plagues, all devastating cause and effect to lead us to this moment.
He slung the silver bullet about his neck, beheld it.
I miss the little things.
He let it go, looked away as if it fell against his strobing chest. Paul Serene shuddered, cried out as the sickness extended further up his throat, into his skull, and touched his brain. Jack kicked off against the diagnostics, used what energy he had left to flash the distance between them, which Paul countered by warping at him, half a foot to the left, swinging an extended forearm into Jack's face. Jack went down, and the thing that had been Paul Serene followed up, driving a booted heel downward. Jack flinched aside, the boot cracking the floor near his head, pressed his hands to the floor, and Paul dropped a knee into Jack's back. Jack buckled, smashed the floor, realizing almost immediately that he could feel nothing below his waist. Paul stepped backwards.
You die here so that Mara can succeed.
He pointed toward the stairwell, one level up. Phasing and flickering was a shifter. The shifter. The shining palm.
That kills you.
Paul drew out his handgun.
This here is the last vision I ever had.
It was almost gone. Shifter Paul clutched for the bullet about his neck, tore it free, focused on it. The reminder he had carried for over 20 years of friendship, his humanity. A reminder that nothing is to be taken for granted, and that time is finite, so better get on living. It seemed to grant him some cohesion, some peace, some focus. The sickness surged. Paul screamed. Jack pulled his handgun and fired. Agonized howls rolled out of the shining palm as potential actions condensed to singular realities, moment to moment, lacerating him. The bullet passed through empty air, sparked off the diagnostics.
You're not all gone, are you?
Paul was by the breach. Jack fired. Retargeted back. Fired. The shining palm kept screaming, writhing, staggering, and flashing in microbursts down the stairs. Jack dumped his last magazine, tossed the gun aside, rolled. The shining palm flashed across the space.
You!
Shifter Paul gasped, tearing himself apart through the act of keeping himself together.
Waste time!
Jack flipped on his back. The shining palm reached down and opened its flashing hand towards Jack's face.
Not really.
Jack gasped, rolled, flipped to his feet and cannon shoulder first into Paul. The countermeasure flew free from Paul's hand. Jack flashed, intercepted it, skidded to a halt, spun toward Paul. Jack had the countermeasure, and realized the shining palm was now directly behind him. Jack had dumped his entire chronon reserve into the warp fight, and replenished just enough to snatch the countermeasure from a rapidly deteriorating Paul. Now, it was back at zero. Paul came for him. Jack spun, hand over the countermeasure's release.
I'm pretty sure I can pop this. And I'm pretty sure that if I do it, it'll take out you and this thing behind me.
Jack backed up, keeping an eye on both Paul and the shifter.
Did you see this? Jack said. Can you see how this plays out?
Paul, or whatever was left of Paul, was beyond language. It just held out one hand, reaching for the countermeasure. A complex mind reduced to the last thing that drove it, perhaps. The shifter took one heavy step forward.
I will do this, Will, Jack said. Get behind something.
The shifter roared, flexed that open palm, and lumbered straight for Jack, screaming. Jack spun, countermeasure extended in both hands, catch ready to pop.
Stop!
Unexpectedly, the shifter did exactly that. Its phasing, shining palm hovered 2 feet from Jack's face. It did not move. It only growled, in 1,000 voices, and strained its hand toward him. Beth had done the same thing in her final moment.
Trust the villain.
Jack looked. Beneath the distortion, resting within that palm, that phased constantly through 1,000 variations of itself, one thing remained constant. The flash of light at its center. A single silver bullet. A reminder to take nothing for granted. That time is finite. The shifter made a sound, like 100 abandoned dogs very far away.
What?
Paul croaked horribly.
Are you doing?
The head of the shifter was a flashing fractal mess. This close to it, Jack could make out the face of the person it used to be. Had always been. He lowered the countermeasure and stood aside. Paul and the shifter locked eyes. The shifter crossed the space between them with purpose. Paul, human enough to be panicked beyond reason by this thing he had feared for 17 years, brought up one useless, shifting hand as the shifter's shining palm accepted Paul's. Palm to palm, bullet to bullet, and Paul Serene met the thing he was fated to become. The thing he had always been. 4-dimensional, existing at once across all times, midwifing the cause and effect that led to all things being as they are, including his own rebirth. The sickness took him completely. His eyes locked with his shining palm self, and in that moment, the two became one. The shining palm, existing 4-dimensionally, embraced Paul, embraced itself. At the moment of its own rebirth, the shining palm had saved him in Monarch Tower. This was the same creature that had tunneled Jack through time from 2010 to now, thereby ensuring that he would be here, that events would play out as they had. Paul Serene would become the shining palm. Paul's ability to perceive and explore multiple oncoming timelines, all part of himself becoming four-dimensional, of growing closer to this thing he was meant to become, had always been. Things play out as they must. The universe won't be bargained with. Both forms were lost in a corona of light as Paul's sickness took him completely. Paul Serene was gone. The shining palm remained, but was unchanged, uncertain. Newborn, flickering, phasing. It looked to Jack, studied itself, at the shining point of reflected light it held in its hand, threw back its head and... The stutter broke. Rain and wind poured into the shattered lab with renewed ferocity. "Jack!" Will ran across the expanse. Jack was staring at the spot where his friend had been. "What just happened?" "I'll explain later," Will said, gently taking the countermeasure. "But if we're going to do this, it has to happen now. The next stutter that hits may well be the last." Underneath the machine, Will decoupled a few fat, insulated wires from each other, using the countermeasure as a go-between for the chronon flow between core and corridor. "The countermeasure is built to brute force recalibration of the MJ field," he said, "resulting in the timeline falling back in sync with itself. If it works, we should see an end to the stutters. If that happens, it means the field is no longer bleeding out, and universal chronon levels have restabilized." He made the final connection. Jack gasped, toppled into the wall of the maintenance loop. Will steadied him. "It's coming. A really big one." Jack held onto his brother, found his feet. "This isn't going to work if the countermeasure isn't charged. Can you show me what to do?" Will had lived his share of terrible moments, keeping his secrets, sacrificing his life on a long shot that maybe he could save the world. Jad didn't want to add another, but there was no choice. Soberly, Will pointed to the access hatch about the size of a fist. "The device is hooked into the machine. I can activate it remotely from the control room upstairs. The depth of the maintenance well and the distance from the machine should protect me from the, effects. You turn it on, I do my thing. Easy." Will nodded. "Jack." Beth explained everything. "Let's finish up here, then go get a couple of beers. You and me." The two brothers left it at that, Will laying a hand on Jack's arm before climbing out of the maintenance ring. The second pre-stuttered blasted through Jack. It wasn't just the world falling into pieces. The next stutter that hit was going to start taking people apart. "Will, hurry!" 12 different Jacks socked it into the core, eliciting a thump and bass hum from the corridor. The machine was online. Jack held the countermeasure in both hands, nestled awkwardly amid a tangle of wall wiring. Counted down from 3. Thought of Beth. Catches flipped. The hatch popped open and all the light of heaven spilled out. Jack plunged his hand inside, felt the countermeasure's heat penetrate his cells. Jack poured every particle of energy he had down to his arm into the countermeasure. Above him, familiar distortion waves were building off the corridor ring. The light grew brighter. In a room overhead, William Joyce flicked the switch, and the corridor ring activated. The countermeasure flared as bright as the sun, and Jack Joyce was lost in light.